Welcome back, folks. Mr. Delcourt here. If you're watching this video, you've accessed today's remote learning lesson via Google Classroom. Happy to be back with you. If you have any questions throughout the lesson today or on anything involving the assignment, please, again, email me. I'm here all day watching my email closely and here to answer questions and help as much as possible. So use me as a resource, and I thank you for working hard here remotely to continue our learning while we're away. Today we're going to talk about this concept of ecological succession, which is this idea that we have disturbance in the forest, and slowly over time our ecological communities change, kind of marching in the same direction towards this mature kind of old growth looking forest. And we're going to think about what all these different things look like. I talk about this during this section of the class because right now we're working on our recent clearing trees, our paper birch, gray birch, yellow birch, black cherry, and quaking aspen. Hopefully, at this point today, you've already played Kahoot and continued your practice there, because don't forget, we're going to take the quiz on those 5 species next time. So you want to learn those 5 species of trees and commit yourself to practicing. Practice with that tree ID. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about forest succession today and think about areas around the state where we see this already. I got this slideshow from Maine Audubon. It works great for this concept, so I just tend to use it. Right off the bat, as we walk around the Maine woods, many of you guys who have spent some time in the woods have seen this. You found a rock wall. And one of the coolest parts about rock walls in the Maine woods is they tell a story. They tell us that the landscape has not always looked the same and been used for the same purposes. These rock walls around the state signify an area that used to be farmland, either pasture or cropland that has since reverted back to forest. And it's crazy to think about, to be standing in some of these mature seeming forests. We love to think that it's always looked that way and always will, but there's certainly a footprint on the landscape from human use years and years ago. I love looking at these stone walls because I think about the people that built them. That thing was built by some guy plowing his field with horses or oxen, and one by one lugging those rocks over and building that wall. These are some really tough, resilient people, our ancestors here in Maine from just a few generations ago. So really cool stuff. I love seeing those rock walls out in the woods. And yeah, here in Maine we have this idea of what we call field to forest succession. What used to be agricultural field has since reverted to forest. So let's take a look here. Back in the 1830s, even up through the mid-1800s, Maine was really a booming agricultural landscape. We raised a lot of sheep for wool, and all of our crops were grown in the fields, and so there was a lot of land clearing that went on to grow these crops. We had a lot of succession occur into the early 1900s when we reverted back to forest, at which case we started harvesting a lot of lumber to fund industry all over the world. Maine has been a booming lumber producer worldwide for a lot of its history. And then we fast forward to today, where we have one of the most heavily forested landscapes in the nation, and as our forest industry has dwindled off a little bit, as agricultural demands have shifted more towards the Midwest and Southern California, we just don't have as much cleared land, and all that field has reverted back to forest. It's crazy to think about how different Maine looked back then, but it really, really did. So as we fast forward here, we look at a picture from Bowdoin, Maine that almost looks like Kansas. I mean, very few trees, wide open, but this is what it would have looked like back in the day. And to this day, you can find a lot of this type of stuff in the Maine woods. That's an old farmhouse foundation. That one's from Acton, but these things are everywhere. When I used to work for that surveyor, we'd be roaming around the woods doing jobs, and we'd find foundations everywhere. And the things we would find around them with metal detectors were just really, really cool, old artifacts and stuff. It was pretty awesome. I like this image because it shows the various levels of succession we find here in Maine. We have field, shrub, and young forest. And a key word we're going to use a lot in this class is this idea of disturbance. Anytime we disturb a landscape, it's going to start back at the starting point of succession, which is essentially bare ground. We have natural forms of disturbance and man-made forms of disturbance. Honestly, your lawnmower is a good example of man-made disturbance. If you left your lawn alone and didn't disturb it with a lawnmower, it would revert back to forest. So that's essentially all you're doing when you mow your lawn every week. You could tell mom or dad, hey, I'm going outside to disturb the lawn, because that's really what you're doing. You're causing disturbance, and you're keeping it at that earliest stage of succession field. If we leave it alone for 10 or 15 years, we're going to see small shrubs beginning to take over and young trees. And we leave that lawn alone for 20 or 30 years, you're going to have a young forest where your lawn used to be. And it really happens kind of quickly. So that disturbance can be man-made with a lawnmower. It could be natural disturbance. The bison were essentially the disturbance crew of the Great Plains that through grazing kept those plains grassland. When the bison were wiped out, we saw a lot of the plains revert to forest because of the lack of grazing pressure by bison. So tons of examples of succession all around us here in Maine and elsewhere. Here's an old field that's reverting to forest. We can see off in the background an even older forest where those white pine seeds are coming from. And here we have young pine trees. We've got a northern red oak, Quercus rubra. Look at that pinnate leaf with pointed lobes. Oh, beautiful. And we got some common juniper over here, another classic kind of pastureland plant. But yeah, young forest coming up in what used to be probably a pasture. I love finding these too. We have some of these in the TA forest, what we call wolf trees, which are these old, really wide, fat trees. They're open-grown trees. They grew in a field. You can tell by their shape that they grew in a wide open field, yet they're surrounded by forest today. And how is that possible? Well, they're much older than the trees around them, and they actually grew originally in a wide open field, and they've since been closed in upon by the forest. So there's a great example of field to forest succession, and we have a couple trees exactly like that out behind TA that we'll have to go find when we get back here in person. Here's a great example of what much of northern Maine looks like, areas of old clear cuts. We've got early successional habitat. We've got young quaking aspen. And you can see there they're using the term popple, what we talked about last class. And we also see a lot of birch in there, and that is some awesome habitat for ruffed grouse and woodcock and snowshoe hare, as well as food for deer and moose and all these game creatures that we really like here in Maine. They all really, really benefit from this early successional habitat. And there you go. There's a moose, an example of a creature that really relies on early successional habitat as a food source. They're going to come out to the edge of this road, and oh, look at this. Striped maple, Acer pennsylvanicum growing right along the side of the road, and those moose love that stuff. Remember the name moose maple. So there you have a moose standing in some early successional habitat along the side of a road. Now, road building is a good example of disturbance. There you have the road. It's regularly disturbed by trucks and cars driving along it. That keeps it bare dirt. If you stop driving on that dirt road, it will slowly grow grass and eventually young trees, and it'll revert back to forest eventually. You can see along the side of the road where it maybe only gets mowed once a year is kept at field, and then along the very edge there, it's reverting back to forest pretty well. Here's out west, some big quaking aspen trees out west in areas, an old burn site probably that has reverted back to forest, to quaking aspen. And here you have some early successional stages here in Maine. We see a lot, again, aspen, quaking aspen or poplar here in Maine, and those pine and hemlock trees growing underneath it. Remember, aspen and a lot of our early successional trees are very short-lived. So these trees are going to live out their lives. The pines and hemlocks and oaks are going to catch up and shade them out, and eventually revert to this kind of more mature-looking forest that we tend to think of here in Maine with that really dark, well-developed canopy. A lot of the TA forest looks a lot like that, pretty closed-in, well-developed canopy out there. So we'll skip along here. We're looking at various forms of succession. Here's a great example of some old growth forest where you can see there has not been a disturbance in a long, long time. And we've got trees living and dying, living out their lives and falling over. And we have what's known as a multi-aged stand here with young trees and very, very old ones all kind of amongst each other. Those dead trees become really great habitat for porcupines. There you go. There's a nice porcupine den tree we've looked at. That porcupine den we found earlier in the year. And then I just want to skip ahead here. This is a concept we'll talk about a little more in the future, is this idea of pillow and cradle. And one of the classic signs when we get out into the TA forest or anywhere of a landscape that's been plowed before, that's been turned into agricultural field, is the lack of pillow and cradle. So as these trees blow over in windstorms and ice storms and hurricanes and things like that, we've all seen examples of this where we have a big giant root ball that comes up in the air and we get a depression in the ground behind it. When that tree rots away, which it will in the next 15, 20 years, what's left is a big pile of dirt. We call that the pillow. And down below it, in that area to the left, that crater in the ground that takes centuries to fill in, we call that the cradle. So when we walk through a forest, we can find really, really old pillows and cradles. And there you go. There's your cradle right in the middle of the screen right here. And there's your pillow, that mound of dirt that was created by the root ball. The tree is long gone. And what we have here is a classic pillow and cradle. Now, when people came through and logged and pulled all the stumps out and plowed the land, they flattened it and they removed the pillow and cradle. So if I'm walking in the forest in southern Maine, I'm looking for pillows and cradles, old ones that can tell me, wow, this land has never been plowed before. If the ground kind of looks awkwardly flat and there's no pillow and cradle, the odds are you're standing in an old pasture or an old agricultural field, even though it feels like it may have been forest forever. So here's a good example of a natural disturbance in the forest. Beavers, right? They build a dam, they flood out an area, and they create this area of natural disturbance. If those beavers leave, if they're trapped out or predators get them or they run out of food and move on, that beaver dam is going to wash out. That meadow is going to dry out again, and you're going to get that classic succession of young growth that's going to come in and eventually revert back to a mature forest. Over and over again, this happens over centuries in the Maine woods. And here's another form of disturbance, insects, right? So this is out west, but here in Maine, we certainly have insect pests that can kill vast numbers of trees. In northern Maine, they really worry about the spruce budworm, and that's just one example. But insects can cause a lot of damage in the forest too and create disturbance and essentially create opportunities for young trees. And, you know, fire as well out west and certainly here in Maine is a natural form of disturbance that creates the opportunity for ecological succession. And this last slide is really interesting. Here's a shot from Baxter State Park. That's South Branch Pond down there below that hiker. Baxter State Park was donated to the state of Maine by Governor Percival Baxter, who bought the whole thing himself. He was a wealthy dude, and it was pretty awful looking when he donated it. It had been burned and logged and just really decimated, but he recognized the process of ecological succession, and he said, if we protect this area, it will come back and it will be a beautiful place someday. That was 100 years ago or so, and it truly is now. If you've ever been there, hard to imagine that landscape had ever been decimated the way it was, but it is a truly beautiful place now, and that's all thanks to ecological succession. So the next time you see the wind blow a tree over, or maybe fires burning small areas, or even logging activities, oftentimes people get really upset and think the woods are ruined forever, but ecological succession tells us that disturbance in the forest is natural. And there's a lot of creatures that really rely on succession for some pretty important habitat. So today's assignment, we're going to use Google Earth. And if you don't have it, get it on your iPad. And I'm going to show you how to work on that today. I'm going to just quickly go through how to complete this assignment. I think it's really neat to virtually travel around the world and look at examples of succession all around us. You don't need to go to this first place, but I want to show you one that I drive by every day on my way to work at Snell Family Farm in the summertime. If I'm zooming in here on, where am I at? Let's go out Route 112. We're coming into Buxton. Here we go, across Torrey Hill. Here's Snell Farm. When I come to work every day at Snell Farm, I'm driving up Route 112 in Buxton. There's an old house that's been abandoned, and I often think of this class because I talk to you guys a lot about what would happen if you didn't mow your lawn for a while. So we're driving along Route 112, a.k.a. River Road in Buxton. What do we got for trees here? Oh, what is that? Holy cow, we got a horse chestnut. Non-native, remember. Palmately compound leaves. Nice. Nothing like a little Google Earth tree ID. Look at what we're coming up on here, though. This is the house I wanted to show you. I look at this all the time. Here's a house that was abandoned basically when I was in high school about 15 years ago. And if we look, we can see sometime about 15 years ago, they stopped mowing this lawn. Nobody's lived here in a long time. And what do we see growing in the front lawn? But some of the very species we're learning about. Those trees that are just starting to turn yellow there are quaking aspens, Populus tremuloides. And there's even some gray birch in there too, Betula populifolia. So there you have it. There's about, 10 years out or so, some ecological succession. You'll see this all around in fields that have been abandoned where we stop growing crops or stop haying. And great example of ecological succession right in front of our eyes. What do we have here? Holy cow, we got an ash tree, a couple ash trees, probably white ash right there. Good stuff. All right, so here's what we're going to work on with our assignment. Let's go back here to Notability. I've already downloaded the assignment out of Google Classroom. I have it right here. I'm asking you, what types of disturbances serve to keep the lawn around you, around your home, from becoming forest? We're thinking about just walking on the thing is disturbing it, right? And there's bugs out there eating your grass, and the lawnmower is a really, really big one. So there's all kinds of different ways that we disturb our lawn and keep it lawn. We also use things like, some people use herbicides to kill weeds and things that are slowly working on ecological succession, returning that lawn to a forest. So now let's use Google Earth, and let's go to a couple different places. So the first one we're going to check out, and it says 5 to 10 years here. It's actually 12 years or so, maybe more. We're going to go to Detroit here in a minute. And Detroit's a good example of an area. Detroit is a city that has shrunken tremendously in the past several decades because of economic downturn. After 2008, when our auto industry went through some really hard times, large parts of Detroit were abandoned because these auto workers had no jobs anymore and moved on. And since then, houses have burned down and fallen down, and we have areas that it's hard to believe you're walking through the United States from the area we live in, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. So we're thinking this is 12 years out or so. What's it going to look like, ecological succession, if we just abandon a neighborhood? So we're going to go to Louisiana Street in Detroit through Google Earth. So if you go to Google Earth and search Louisiana Street, Detroit, let's see, let's do a search here. I'm going to go, oh, I already have it in there, right here on the left. Louisiana Street, Detroit, Michigan. Here we go. And we're zooming over here to Detroit, Louisiana Street, zooming in now. Really, doesn't matter what direction you go. Let's maybe go this way up Louisiana Street. First of all, before we even go to Street View, you can see these are neighborhoods that used to be full of houses. And there are just very, very few houses left. Many of them have been burned down through arson for people to essentially get some insurance money out of these houses that they defaulted on during the economic downturn after 2008. You can explore a lot of these streets. I mean, Minnesota Street looks like it's pretty desolate too. I'm going to take you down Louisiana Street, and we'll look at kind of the effects of, actually, let's go right down here on Louisiana Street, and we'll look. You can see the old sidewalks are literally reverting back to plant life here. So here we go, classic areas that used to be neighborhoods, and as we look out across, we see it about 10 or 12 years later, we're seeing an area that's reverting back to field, and in the areas that the city isn't mowing, it's really reverting back to a young forest. Here's a green ash tree. We're going to learn about green ash. Oh my goodness, I just saw elm trees. Come on, right here, American elm. Look at that right in front of us, Ulmus americana. Check out the offset bases on some of those leaves. Good stuff. Oh my goodness, it just doesn't get any better than this. So here we go. We're still cruising down Louisiana Street. Keep in mind, this used to be somebody's neighborhood, people, okay? What we have here are ash trees that have been killed by a horrible bug we're going to learn about next week called the emerald ash borer, which has done real damage out there in Michigan. Bro, more American elm. Look at the offset bases. I'm just amped right now. Can't even handle it. Look at the street crumbling. I mean, classic ecological succession. Look at the plants coming out of the cracks in the road. This will be forest someday here, even over this pavement. So, ooh, a bird. Look at that. What is that? It looks like an American robin, maybe? I don't know. Hard telling there. Good stuff here. Look at the trash. What are we doing? What are people? Come on, pick up after yourselves. You know, it's just awful out here. So, Louisiana Street, Detroit, Michigan. Coming up on somebody's house. Handful of people left living here. There you go. Conditions not looking so great on Louisiana Street, but it's a great scientific example of what happens when we stop mowing the lawn for a dozen years or so. So the city has since come in. They're mowing to try to keep it as open as possible. To maybe they're hoping for some economic development someday. So you're going to want to take a screenshot somewhere along this journey, paste it in that assignment, and then give me a verbal description in a few complete sentences about what you're seeing, what types of plant life. We're looking at, fields that are reverting to like a young forest here, okay? So the next phase of our assignment, we're going to go to Chernobyl. okay? An area that about 34 years ago, there was a nuclear disaster, and basically nobody has lived there for 34 years. We're not necessarily going strictly to Chernobyl. We're going to a city right next to Chernobyl called Pripyat, where all the workers from the Chernobyl power plant lived in the Soviet Union at the time. And this entire city has been abandoned for 34 years after the disaster. And what you're going to see is a city that is reverting back to forest. It's pretty eerie, and ecological succession is on full display here. So let's search Kurchatova Street in Google Earth, and that's going to take us just to the spot I want you to look at in Chernobyl. And again, feel free to explore all around. There's some crazy stuff to look at in Pripyat, and some pretty eerie examples of what can happen after a disaster like this. So Kurchatova Street in Pripyat. So let's go to Google Earth, and I'm going to search, let's see, Kurchatova Street. It's that second one down, Kurchatova Street in Pripyat, right here. And here we go. We're traveling across the Atlantic. We're heading to Ukraine, and boom, now we're down here. If I zoom out, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is right here. It's since been entombed in what they call the sarcophagus, this brand new building that's essentially hopefully going to contain all that horrible radiation and stuff that's still dangerous for thousands of years inside of there. And here we have Pripyat, this beautiful city. This used to be a modern city in the 80s where people lived, and these are all buildings out in the woods essentially now, where these are all housing projects and things. So if we go to Street View here, we drop down anywhere on like Kurchatova Street. This looks like it's at one point some sort of main drag out through the city. Oops. I didn't quite get to Street View. I got to some viewpoint from top of a building, or maybe some drone footage here. But check it out. I mean, this is actually a cool way to look at it. You can see look at the sarcophagus off in the distance over there. There's the power plant reactor. But you can see that this entire city is reverting back to forest. It is crazy to think about. But these buildings are crumbling. Nobody's lived here or been here really actively in 34 years or so. And we've got forest taking over what used to be city. Oh, look at that. Battery's low, Rob's probably borrowing my charger, so we're going to have to deal with it. But yeah, look at this. Oop, look, some people down here. It's actually become kind of a tourist destination. You can go for short periods of time, but nobody wants to live there these days. So crazy stuff. If we go down, try to get to like Street View here in a second. Let's just drop in on Kurchatova Street, like over here. Here we go. All right, so here we go. Now we're driving down what used to be like a main street down through here. And interestingly enough, if we think about ecologically, the climate of this area is very similar to Maine. So they have a lot of similar species, not identical to us, but a lot of birches and maples and things like that, or maple-like species growing out here. Just really interesting stuff. A screenshot like this would be perfect for the assignment, like, really maturing forest around old crumbling buildings. So just a great example of what ecological succession looks like in a man-made landscape, 30 or more years out. So we could see Detroit 12 years out, Chernobyl 34 years out, and the differences in those stages of succession. So I hope you enjoyed today's class, thinking about the woods a little differently, thinking about it as like a dynamic place where plant and animal communities are constantly changing. Disturbance in the forest is not always a bad thing. It's natural, and a lot of species really rely on these young forests. So looking forward to showing you guys examples of ecological succession in person as we get back together and get outside this spring. So hang in there. I really appreciate you guys' hard work on all these assignments. And as always, feel free to reach out through email with any questions. I'm here all day to answer them, and I'd love to help you clear up any confusion. So thanks a bunch, and good luck.